All right, hey, good morning. Michael Martin here. Hey, check it out. It just so happens today we're going to talk about John Keats. And look, my daughter gave me this cup for Christmas a couple years ago, which is it's a quote from John Keats's letters. I'm certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. You want a tattoo? That's what you get here for your tattoo. That's sitting right there. Anyway, so it's kind of cold here in Waterloo Township this morning. But yesterday, yesterday was what was the 20? Well, actually, a few days ago, the 21st, was the 203rd anniversary of the death of John Keats at the tender age of 25. Really a tragic story, because he was just coming into his own as a poet, and so lately I've been reading the poetry, the collected works of A.E. George William Russell, the Irish poet. And I started, when you start to read collected book collections of poetry, like complete works. If you start at the beginning and go to the end, very often you won't get to the end because at the beginning the poet's not quite there yet. Um, it's okay. I mean, it's not bad. It's just not good. You can even see this in Yeats, one of my favorite poets. I mean, it's not that his poems in the early times weren't bad, but the stuff he did toward the end of his life, in the last 2 decades of his life, was phenomenal. Um, so you have to wonder what would have happened with John Keats had he lived, because he was in his last years he was writing his best poetry. And if you look at his first, he only had put out 3 volumes of poetry while he lived, and the first uh, was what's it called? Just the poems by John Keats, and then there was the Endymion, and then Lamia and other poems, which came out just before he died. And in that book, that's where all the good stuff. I shouldn't say the good stuff. That's where the great odes show up in that one. And he's pretty good. I mean, just remarkable. So last night, actually, I decided I was reading some Keats. I've read Keats forever, but I decided to read some. And those to read a couple lines from a couple of poems here. I think the opening to Endymion is a pretty extraordinary. It's a long form poem. It's not really an epic, but it's long form. Definitely influenced by John Milton. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. It's pretty brilliant. Now, what I love about what makes Keats's poetry, besides the imagery and the musicality of the language, the imagery, is what he does is with enjambment is nothing short of brilliant. And enjambment, in case you don't know, is um, running a line past the end of the line. So running the line so it doesn't have punctuation at the end of the line, like a comma or a period. It's because if you do that and you're using rhyme, as Keats does, it can start to sound sing-songy. But he lets the line go to the next line, well, kind of dropping off the rhyme along the way, and it's just brilliant because it disguises the rhyme, but because it's almost like subliminal, where but the it accentuates the musicality that way, almost the melody, you could say. And he's brilliant at this. Probably it's greatest talent. And of course, he's also what's really kind of cool about Keats is his love for the ancient Greece, which shows up over and over and over in his poetry. Um, which is kind of an interesting thing in English Romanticism, because there was one school of English Romanticism which was turning to nature. You see this in Wordsworth and Coleridge to a degree, or fantasy, where Coleridge, when he gets into his kind of, you could almost call it a Gothic mode, because we do know that Romanticism, kind of in a way you could say, decays into the Gothic, where Mary Shelley, for instance, with Frankenstein, is a great example of that. And there are many others, but this first flowering is full of youthful idealism, which is, so Keats and Shelley Shelley died at 29 or 30, Keats at 25. There's this idealism that it's just so appealing to me anyway. Um, but Keats is just, I mean, this is why everybody loves him because he's so darn good. And he died at 25. Philip Levine, I don't know if you know who that is. Philip Levine was a Detroit poet, even though he lived most of his life in California. But he grew up and he went to school in Detroit, and he's a very working class poet. But his poetry too is deeply influenced by Keats. And what he said in an interview once is that, you know, even more than the poetry, it was the Keats of the letters that really inspired him. And as my coffee mug will attest, the letters are brilliant. And if you haven't read the letters, I admonish you, get out there and read those letters. Oh, they're so good, so beautiful. And he talks about everything because we are a very unlettered culture. We're, can you imagine in 100 years, you know, who's a popular writer, and the collected emails of Michael Martin, right? It's not going to happen. The collected texts and emails, but we have the letters of John Keats, and they're to his siblings, and he often puts a poem into them, or his friends, and of course, probably more. Some of the best letters are those to his beloved Fanny Braun. Now, I don't want to make this a very long video. I just don't want to make it short and sweet and to the point. But I can't encourage people to read Keats enough if you haven't. This is the one. He's the poet, I think, where kids in school, if they are exposed to it, this is the guy. This is the poetry that makes them go, "Wait a minute. There's something here that's beautiful, and I don't know what it is, but I want to find out." And one of my favorite poems by Keats. I mean, I love the great odes, and actually, shout out to my buddy Spencer Clavin. Last summer, we were both speakers at a conference in Washington D.C., and one of the things that Spencer had the participants do is start to memorize the opening lines of Ode on a Grecian Urn. Thou unravished pride of quietness, which is how it starts. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, because the memorization of poetry it's a lost art, and it's something we need to regain, which is what I think Spencer was getting at there. Now, I'll just read a little bit from Ode to a Nightingale, which, yesterday on Twitter or X, I asked people what their favorite Keats poem was. And I don't think anybody said this one, but you don't have that many followers. But this may be my favorite. I mean, I have a lot of favorites, but this may be my all-time favorite Keats poem for some reason. And I'll just read the opening and maybe one other stanza. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and Lethe words had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Now, if you don't know the story, Keats, his brother Tom, died not long before this. His younger brother, and he was very close to his siblings. And I'm sure it traumatized Keats, because Keats was basically the one taking care of Tom. And Tom, I think, was only 18 when he died of tuberculosis, which would later take John Keats's life. And so that's certainly we can attribute some of the melancholy, at least, that's found in Keats' poetry to contending with the death of his brother, actually his parents as well, and of his not very promising fortunes, living almost not in poverty, but very poor, not much of a living, didn't have enough money to marry even, which he wanted to do. Let me read one more stanza from Ode to a Nightingale. Darkling I listen. For many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now no more ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Because Keats died not long after this, so he probably knew his he had a death sentence and he would not live long. So anyway, and I should tell you, actually, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a film made by Jane Campion called Bright Star, which is actually going to be another one to read before I depart here. Which I can't remember the name of the actors. Ben Whishaw plays Keats, and Abby something normal. Abby something plays Fanny Grunt, and it's just a beautiful movie. And what I love about the movie, besides it's really the cinematography is extraordinary, but I don't know what percent, but it's over 50% of the dialogue in that film comes from John Keats's letters and poetry, which is extraordinary. Which is you really get caught up in the language, and if I had my head on, my head out would go off to Jane Campion for making those decisions, because it's brilliant. Great film if you can see it. I don't think the reviews were that great, but I've shown it to students when I teach romanticism, and there's not a dry eye in the house at the end of the film. So heartbreaking. But before we go on, and we'll finish in a minute here. Let's read this last sonnet, which he wrote to Fanny Brawne. And actually, in the film, the end of the film is after Keats's death, where and Fanny, in mourning clothes, recites this poem. And Bright Star was Keats's nickname or image of Fanny. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient sleepless eremite, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live forever, or so live ever, or else swoon to death. I'm getting chills. Such a beautiful sonnet, and it's a sonnet. In fact, in this collection I have, it's called His Last Sonnet, or usually it's called Bright Star. Now, the last thing I want to do is actually from Keats's first collection, and another one of my favorites. And I like this one in particular because it's short enough to memorize. And I used to do this one with my students when I was a Waldorf teacher. I would have them, say in 7th grade, we'd recite this. And it's his poem on first looking into Chapman's Homer. So let's see if I can do it from memory. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western isles have I been, which bards and fealty to Apollo hold. Much have I heard of one wide expanse that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. Now it's just brilliantly put together Petrarchan sonnet. So what he does, so I don't know where this is in the book even. It's what's in his first collection. So there it is, page 47. So I just want to unpack a little bit of this before we depart. So, so one of the things people say about this is, well, Keats got it wrong. Cortez wasn't the one who first saw the Pacific. It was Balboa. But guess what? That ain't the point. A piece of beard in my mouth. That's not the point. The point is, just like with the translation of Homer by George Chapman, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare's. I mean, this was probably not the first time Keats read Homer. He probably read Homer in other translations, right? Or I don't know if he knew Greek. And the same thing with all of us, right? Doesn't matter who gets there first. It's what matters is who first gets to you. And I think we could see the same thing with translations of scripture, even, right? I mean, you read some and they just, but you read another one and something just penetrates you, right? You get it. And I think this is the point that Keats is trying to make. It's not who was there first. It's that who embodied the experience. Because even if you're not the first one to see it, when you see it, it's as if you see it for the first time, and you're the first person who's ever seen it, because you're the first person who's seen it in this way. So that's one thing. The other thing is in sonnets. I mean, if you don't know, I mean, a lot of people can turn off the show now. And what happens in sonnets, especially in a Petrarchan sonnet or Italian sonnet like this one, you have basically two parts. You have the octave, the first eight lines, and the sestet, the last six. And usually what happens in the octave is one kind of set of metaphors are put into use by the poet. And so here, it's traveling, right? Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, right? I was there before. I've been there a lot of times, right? And he's talking about kingdoms, right? In many goodly states and kingdoms seen, and that which Homer ruled as his demesne, right? These are all things of ownership and travel and, in a way, conquest. But what happens? So that's the octave, right? So he's using those kinds of metaphors in the octave. But then what happens between the octave and the sestet is what we call the volta, or the jump, right? Like switch directions. I could go into another gear. And this is why this poem is so brilliant. Because then he switches from the ancient world to pretty much the modern world. Right? When he says, then felt I like a watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez, right? When with eagle eyes they're discovering things that they were always there, right? They're discovering things that were always there. Just like truth, beauty, and goodness, right? They're always there. But unless you discover for yourself, it doesn't matter. In all his men. Or like, I'll just recite the last 6 lines. Then felt eyes like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. All right. It's a little piece of wonder for all of you on this Saturday morning, and don't forget to read John Keats' letters and poetry. And see that movie, okay? All right, take care, God bless, and see you next time.